Hi everyone, my name is Harmilan Kaur and today my team and I are going to talk about an institution-based view of international business strategy with a focus on emerging economies. So this perspective paper talks about the institution-based view of international business. It is positioned as one leg that helps sustain the strategy tripod, the other two legs being the industry and resource-based views. So the two important questions that are being addressed are what drives the firm's strategy in international business and what determines the success and failure of firms around the world. There are two perspectives that address those two questions. So the first one is the industry-based view, which is represented by Porter. It argues that conditions within an industry, to a large extent, determines the firm's strategy and performance. The second view, which is a resource-based view, which is exemplified by Barney, suggests that it is firms' specific differences that drive strategy and performance. However, these two views ignore the formal and informal institutional underpinning that provides the competition perspective, as it is based on the US economies, which are relatively stable, and a market-based institutional framework. Furthermore, we see that the research in the paper indicates that there's an increasing appreciation that formal and informal institutions significantly shape the strategy and performance of firms. So this perspective paper builds on several different types of research previously conducted in the IB field and provides with a fundamentally different way to think about the IB strategy. It takes the research one step further by explicitly arguing for the emergence of an institution-based view of IB strategy and positioning it as the third leg of the strategy tripod, the other two legs being the industry and resource-based views. Now, let us define what an institution is. So, institutions are the regulative, normative, cognitive structures and activities that provide stability and meaning to social behavior. They are the humanly devised constraints that structure human interaction. In this sense, institutions can be broadly classified as formal and informal ones. So, institutions govern societal transactions in the area of politics, law, and society. So let us now understand what is the relationship between a culture and an institution. So culture is a substratum of institutional arrangements that can be also viewed as a part of informal institutions in the environment that underpin formal institutions. So this perspective paper focuses on the political, legal, and societal aspects of institutions. To illustrate the legal aspect of the institution-based model, we'll be discussing two important issues in IB, the first one being the anti-dumping as entry barriers, and the second one is the corporate governance in emerging economies. To highlight the political and societal aspects of the institution-based model, we'll be also focusing on two countries that have emerged as important players in the global economy, India and China. Let us now understand what a task environment view is. So, a task environment view focuses on economic variables such as market demand and technological change. A market-based institutional framework has been taken for granted for many years, and formal institutions and informal institutions have been always assumed away as a background condition. In other words, when markets work smoothly in developed economies, the market supporting institutions are almost invisible. However, when market works poorly in emerging economies, the absence of these the strong formal institutions is conspicuous. An institution-based view of strategy treats institutions as independent variables and focuses on the dynamic interaction between institutions and organizations, and also considers strategic choices as the outcome of such an interaction. Therefore, institutions are much more than background conditions that help firms to formulate and implement strategy, which helps them to create a competitive advantage. Institutions also have an impact on diversification strategies, strategic change, and innovation. Next ahead, we have seen over the years that institutionalism has been rising. So this rise of emerging economies also offers great opportunities to extend and develop the institution-based views. A hallmark of this emerging economy is that these economies tend to have more fundamental and comprehensive changes introduced to the formal and formal rules of the game. This would in turn affect the firms as pairs which are labeled as institutional transitions. However, we see that the research on emerging economies has pushed the institution-based view to the cutting edge of strategy research, which is becoming the third leg in the strategy tripod. This is because the profound differences in the institutional frameworks between emerging economies and developed economies force a lot of researchers to kind of pay more attention to these differences in addition to considering industry and resource-based factors. Now, I would be listing down the four diverse areas of the substantive research of this paper. The first one is the anti-dumping as entry barriers. Second one is the competing in and out of India. Third one is growing the firm in China. And the fourth one is governing the corporation in emerging economies. So specifically, such selection is guided by an interest to first cover the more international, like the cross-border aspects of dealings with the firms from emerging economies, and then to focus on salient issues associated with the two of the leading emerging economies, India and China, and then finally to deal with less international but nevertheless very important issues of strategy in emerging economies, which is the corporate governance. Now, let us move ahead with discussing the first area of the substantive research, which is the anti-dumping as entry barriers. So, one of the Porter's five forces that affects the competitiveness of the industry is the height of entry barriers. It is also addressed as the liability of foreigners. The entry barriers research has focused on market-based variables such as economies of scale and product differentiation. Rarely have non-market based institutional variables like anti-dumping laws been explicitly considered as entry barriers in IB. So, an OECD dumping in Australia, Canada, the European Union, and the US would never have been questioned under their own antitrust laws if it has been used by a domestic firm in making domestic sales. Foreign firms, however, are often discriminated against by the formal rules of the game in many countries. Overall, when industry and resource-based weapons fail, there's a direct implication for domestic firms under competitive pressures from imports. In the 21st century, as tariff barriers are no longer tolerated in most parts of the world, non-tariff barriers such as anti-dumping regimes become increasingly important. While defending firms can obtain government assistance through anti-dumping penalties, and entering firms may engage in dumping as a way to gain market share. Entering firms may react to anti-dumping duties through jumping, that is, using foreign direct investment to bypass the anti-dumping barriers. However, the upshot is that the IB strategy research needs to pay more attention to anti-dumping as entry barriers, which would result in an institution-based liability of foreigners.
Hello everyone, my name is Kishan and I'm in third semester MBA program. I will be presenting the next three areas of research. First, competing in and out of India. It has been documented that India has seen a phenomenal rise and is emerging as a leading global player in IT and services. This could be due to the nature of this industry, whose work can be performed off-site, or the enviable combination of low costs and excellent skills. Though these answers are insightful, yet they do not give a complete picture. But an institution-based answer would direct us towards political, legal, and societal changes in institutions. For example, Indian government invested on top 5% of the population that are university eligible. This could be one of the reasons. And more importantly, various legal and regulatory reforms that have liberalized the economy since 1991 could also be a major cause. In fact, these economic reforms post 1991 have made an open, competitive, and entrepreneurial environment possible. However, as the political winds change, some of the Indian firms had a negative impact in West, both formally and informally. Formally, American states started to pass laws to ban Indian firms from being awarded official contracts. This was done to protect their own jobs and interests. And informally, it is the adverse reaction from the people who lost their jobs and numerous politicians and journalists. Even though the West created entry barriers for Indian IP or BPO firms, they failed to focus on exit barriers to control Western MNCs to invest capital and technology in India. Since the outbound FDI in India from Western countries were so extensive that market supporting institutions such as pro outbound FDI policies adopted by the Western governments are now taken for granted and you can see almost invisible. So, overall, a more friendly domestic international environment has enabled the Indian IT BPO firms to flourish. So, moving on to the next research area, it is growing the firm in China. It is strongly established that strong economic growth hardly occur in poorly regulated economies. As China has a relatively underdeveloped formal institutions such as lack of effective goals, scholars were confused by the progress of China, since it is the growth of the firm in the aggregate that leads to the growth of the economy. IB and strategy researchers have endeavored to provide firm level answers to address this intriguing puzzle. Among many answers, it is believed that the interpersonal networks cultivated by managers in the society may serve as informal substitutes for formal institutional support. Chinese culture is also one of the reasons for intensification of networks and relationships. However, it is found that connections are necessary but not enough for good firm performance, and that market based capabilities more significantly drive firm performance. Moreover, it is also agreed by the top Chinese managers that the interpersonal network in China is diminishing. For example, considering an area particularly important in IB as entry modes is the reduced role of JVs over wholly owned subsidiaries. JVs are joint ventures which rely on local partners to direct the institution. So, thereby, it is evident that it is the combination of formal and informal institutional frameworks that shapes strategic choices. The last research area that I'm presenting today is called the corporate governance in emerging economies. Corporate governance research has historically focused on developed economies, in particular the United States and the United Kingdom, which is collectively known as the Anglo American system, this is based on the assumption of dispersed ownership and a pronounced separation of ownership and control. Here, the key conflicts are principal agent conflicts that arise between shareholders and managers. On the contrary, dispersed ownership is just an exception and does not apply in emerging economies, since most corporations around the world are controlled by a family or the state, characterized by concentrated ownership. In this type of ownership, the key conflicts is between principal, that is, between two classes, namely controlling shareholders, and minority shareholders. It is believed that to enhance corporate governance is to increase the number of outside directors on the board to help improve firm performance, presumably independent. But this is not the case in China, as studies fail to detect an empirical link between outside directors and financial performance. In Anglo American corporations, emphasis is on control and monitoring of management, whereas in emerging economies, it is just a window dressing, which means controlling shareholders do not really want to share their control. Overall, it seems imperative that researchers pay more attention to the institutional approach and consequences of corporate governance in emerging economies instead of simply applying the Anglo American assumption of dispersed ownership and control, which basically does not coincide with the realities in much of the world, especially in emerging economies.
So, in this slide, we talk about the strategy tripod with respect to the Home Depot Canada. Through the paper, we learned about the institution based view of business strategy, which is positioned as one of the three legs that help sustain the strategy tripod. The other two legs comprising industry and resource based views. In the next few slides, including this one, we'll be talking about this statement with respect to the Canadian perspective. The Canadian economy is largely institutional in character since it is constrained by the formal laws and regulations, resulting in a highly coordinated and structured economy. The Home Depot is one of the examples of a company that follows the industry-based strategic perspective. Home Depot is a true representation of Canada's culture and values. It operates in 182 stores across Canada and follows all the rules and laws and regulations, which means that it follows a formal institutions and cultural norms and arcane business practices, which comes under the informal institutions. Home Depot also prioritizes the dynamic relationship with both vendors and customers. These interactions are useful while making strategic decisions. This slide talks about the anti-dumping laws in Canada. Anti-dumping is one of the Canada's trade protectionism tools. It is regulated under the Canada Special Import Measures Act. It is a proactive step taken after a complaint is filed and it is found that items are being sold into the Canadian market at cost lower than the current market values, causing injury to the Canadian industry. If you are a Canadian producer of identical or similar goods that is competing with the imported goods, which are being suspected to be dumped or subsidized and causing injury to the Canadian industry, then the producers can file a complaint with the Canadian Border Service Agency. The complaint must include information on the Canadian produced goods, the competing imports, the domestic industry, and conditions in the Canadian market. It must also provide evidence relating to the dumping or subsidizing of the imported goods and the resulting injury to the Canadian industry. In other words, if a proof of the claim is provided, then a provisional duty may be applied following a preliminary decision by the tribunal that injury by the dumping or subsidizing of imports has occurred. And anti-dumping duties are normally imposed for a period of at least 5 years, after which they are reassessed. In this slide, I'll be talking about a real anti-dumping case. This case is one of the successful Canadian trade remedy case involving complex consumer goods. This case happened in October 2020, where Macmillan LLP, a law firm on behalf of 4 Canadian furniture producers, 2 in Winnipeg and 2 outside of Montreal, led the case. Chinese and Vietnamese produced furniture was unfairly dumped and subsidized, materially injuring the Canadian producers. Then the Canadian Border Service Agency imposed a trade remedy measures on these Chinese and Vietnamese manufacturers. This ruling is a landmark decision in favor of protecting a diverse set of Canadian producers of consumer goods. This anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures case concerns upholstered domestic seating, UDS. UDS is primarily household sofas, chairs, sofa beds, and the measures apply to goods that are either leather made or have motion. Chinese and Vietnamese producers were found to have an unfair advantage in this sector, due to which the Canadian market share shrink from 48% in 2017 down to 32% by 2020. This decision will significantly help a Canadian manufacturing industry that has been hurting for many years in trying to compete with much lower price coming from China and Vietnam. This protection should allow Canadian producers to regain their lost market share and improve profitability to more sustainable level. It could result in the creation of hundreds, if not thousands, of Canadian jobs. In conclusion, I would again like to mention that the institution-based view of business strategy is positioned as one of the 3 legs that help sustain the strategy tripod. The other 2 legs comprising industry and resource-based view. The industry-based view is important for gaining the economies of scale and competing the rivalries by competitive advantage. And resource-based view is important for identifying the firm's potential key resources and product differentiation. Therefore, institutionalization holds great importance in both developed and developing countries, as it helps in achieving strategies and enhancing the overall competitiveness.